Okay, well, thank you so much for that introduction. It is a real pleasure to be here talking to you today on, as we have heard, the 1900th anniversary of Hadrian's visit to these shores. It was a destination so desirable that he was only the second serving emperor to make the trip, and he was later teased for his efforts by a poet who wrote, "I don't want to be a Caesar and stroll about among Britons." Now, there was rather more to his visit than "I came, I saw, I strolled." As we have heard, there were serious matters to attend to. Almost certainly, that included either giving the order to construct Hadrian's Wall or examining it as work was underway. And it is to that monument that I want to turn now and spend the rest of this talk looking at what is it that Hadrian's Wall did. I start with one of my favourite views of Hadrian's Wall. I always find this a very useful place to stop and contemplate the monument, not just because it's a handy place to take a breather after a steep climb, but also because I think it really encourages us to contemplate what it was that Hadrian's Wall was intended to achieve. Now we look at this, and I think words that spring to mind are monumental, majestic, but probably not so much mysterious. After all, a wall is something that we can all relate to. But the truth is, we don't know what Hadrian's Wall did. We do not know what form of division they were attempting to achieve. I think it's fair to say that the two main scholarly schools of thought today can be crudely characterised as, on the one hand, Hadrian's Wall helping to regulate the peaceful movement of people. This was a place where people's peaceful intentions would be ascertained and, doubtless, taxes extracted as they moved north and south. On the other hand, we have a military stop line, a proper military barrier capable of repulsing a full-scale barbarian invasion. Now, why is this point in particular such a useful place to come and contemplate these possibilities? Well, it really comes from the continuation, as you can see, of the wall curtain right on top of this majestic crag. Why did they do that? Are we to imagine people with their carts attempting to avoid paying customs dues by driving up the side of the crag? Are we to imagine a barbarian invasion attempting to scale the crag? On both cases, it seems unlikely. If you look at the Roman frontier systems in North Africa, there they would construct short stretches of wall, blocking valleys, but not carrying them over the adjacent stretches of high ground. So this is not something they had to do on Hadrian's Wall. It's not the case that they just did this on Roman frontiers. Now, this perhaps gratuitous move has given birth to a third possibility, that Hadrian's Wall served no purpose whatsoever other than to act as an extraordinary piece of Roman rhetoric, to demonstrate imperial might by creating a statement of imperial power. So what I really want to do is I want to take an opportunity to look at these different possibilities and ask, what was it that Hadrian's Wall did? Now, I should stress that this is not just a game for modern scholars to play. It is clear enough that Hadrian's Wall's course took it through a densely populated landscape. Even at a conservative estimate, the fates of thousands of people will have depended on exactly what form of division Hadrian and the Roman army intended to achieve in northern England. With that in mind, I would like to introduce the man who is the reason for our colloquium today, Publius Aelius Hadrianus, the man that we know as Hadrian. In modern parlance, he was something of a maverick. His contemporaries considered him to be strange and baffling. Among his eccentricities was, as you can see, to cultivate a beard in the Greek style. But perhaps more dramatic was his decision to avoid the traditional path to imperial martial glory through territorial expansion. Hadrian was much more interested in exploring ways to secure the edges of the empire. And there is surely no greater monument to this fascination than Hadrian's Wall itself. Beside him, we have the only Roman statement on the question of what it was that Hadrian's Wall actually did. As you can see, it is a masterpiece of brevity. Hadrian was the first to build a wall 80 miles long to separate the Romans and barbarians. An awful lot hangs on this word separate. I think the modern world encourages us to remember that there are many, many different forms of separation that can be created. Some borders are relatively easy to pass through, others are comparatively closed. What was the intention on Hadrian's Wall? Now, we'll zoom out just for a moment. This is the world that Hadrian reigned over, the Roman Empire, at the time of his accession. And as you can see, Hadrian's Wall is at first glance a relatively modest element of the Roman frontier system. It runs for just 80 Roman miles, that's 117 kilometres, against the frontier system that ran for roughly 13,000 kilometres through 20 modern countries on 3 continents. Impressive in its scale, without a shadow of a doubt. When you see a red line like this, it sometimes encourages us to imagine uniformity. But what we should not be thinking of here is a whole series of mini Hadrian's walls running around the edges of the Roman Empire. There were many different frontier systems. Very often, impressive natural barriers, such as rivers, would be simply fortified. And in all cases, Hadrian's Wall stands out from its peers by virtue of its scale. It is larger, it is more impressive. So again, we come back to this question, why? What are they attempting to do? Zoom in a little bit. Here we see the wider military zone in northern England at the end of Hadrian's reign. And what I hope you can see from this is that Hadrian's Wall itself is only one component of a much wider military zone. You see a whole network, a web of forts spun through northern England. And what I hope you can also see is that they are not evenly positioned between east and west. Again, this is something that has attracted an awful lot of discussion over the years, this question of why it is you see so many more forts in the west than in the east. One possibility is that those living in the east were comparatively friendly, perhaps even allied, as against the groups in the west who were much more hostile. But what it does seem to suggest is that perhaps the moods of the local groups living in these areas were a factor that the Roman army had to take into account. So, just what would Hadrian have encountered when he went strolling among the Britons? We are here dependent on Roman accounts, and I think it would be fair to say that they give a somewhat unfavourable view of the local population. The Romans, like many groups before and since, were suckers for a good stereotype, and they develop a narrative of your average Britons being simple, savage, or strange. So, just to give a sense, you could have people who can be described as inhuman, lawless, raving, tent-dwelling, naked, uncivilized, lanky, promiscuous. Particularly love the comment by Dyer about groups living north of the wall, plunge into the swamps and exist there for many days with only their heads above water. Exactly. Now, as the Britons did not leave any accounts of their own, we don't have their views to use as a counter. But we can turn to something else. This is the Battersea Shield, fished out of the Thames, as its name suggests, not a million miles from here, and it was almost certainly created in Britain. Now, it is, as you can see, an absolutely glorious example of what is known as Latin or Celtic art. You see these fantastic, flowing, sinuous motifs, and you get examples of this where the artists will hide creatures, sometimes real, sometimes mythological, within the swirling art. So you just glimpse at them. It's an approach which is sometimes referred to as shape-shifting art. But I hope that what you see here is something which is truly sophisticated. sophisticated. This is a really impressive piece of craftsmanship. It was not manufactured by the ignorant savages that the Romans would have us believe existed in Britain when they arrived. This takes us to the question of warfare. Something else that the Britons don't seem to be particularly good at least from a Roman perspective. The account of the final battle of the Boudiccan revolt has us believe that the Roman to Briton kill ratio was 1 Roman soldier for every 200 Britons. That is a staggering figure, even allowing for considerable Roman exaggeration. If you have a ratio of about 1 to 6, then it would still often be the sign of a massive defeat. So 1 to 200 is extraordinary. Now, this has led to people suggesting, not entirely unreasonably, that the Britons were militarily inept or practicing some kind of primitive warfare. But there is an alternative possibility, which is just that they preferred to do their fighting in a rather different way. Rather than forming up to fight great set-piece battles, perhaps we should be thinking about them in a different way. There's been a recent study by Yvonne Innell of Iron Age martial equipment from Britain, and she came to the conclusion that we should be looking at a form of very mobile, loosely formed combat. So British warriors who weren't wearing armour, who would often be equipped with throwing spears, which could be used to rain down on the enemy rather than coming in close to fight pitched battles. Her view is that these groups would be particularly well suited to fighting a form of warfare which we now consider to be guerrilla warfare. We see it time and time again in the modern world, where groups that are facing conventionally vastly superior forces choose to strike their foes while they are vulnerable, and then crucially escape before a massive military reprisal can be mounted. There are many accounts of exactly this form of fighting being practiced by the Britons in the ancient histories. The two areas where we seem to see it in particular are Wales and Scotland. Now, this is of interest because what we also find in Wales is a form of deployment, military deployment by the Roman army that seems to be unprecedented in Britain. You see here behind me this dense network of sites, not just forts but also smaller fortlets positioned between them. So you have interspersed large and small garrison points. Now, curiously, this is exactly the approach that a 19th century military tactician advocates as your best bet for victory against guerrillas, to create a network of forts, to have mobile patrols, to make sure you have larger and smaller forts interspersed to protect communications and logistics. So just possibly, we're seeing the Roman army adapting to exactly the form of warfare that we're told exists in this area in the ancient sources. Now, to move north to the Tyne-Sully Isthmus and the Stanegate System, I'm cutting out Scotland here, which I apologise for. It's often popularly thought that the Roman army invades Britain, advances north, gets to the Tyne-Sully Isthmus, stops and builds Hadrian's Wall. That is not the case, of course. They move north into Scotland, where we find more accounts in the ancient literature of these surprise attacks, and we again see this chains of forts and fortlets interspersed. The Romans think that they fight a decisive battle on the Scottish Highland fringe, but then trouble on the Danube sees perhaps as much as a quarter of the Roman army in Britain being withdrawn, and the Roman army is plunged into a gradual retreat southwards. By AD 105 or so, they are reconfiguring on the Tyne-Sully Isthmus and create this network known as the Stanegate System. What I hope you can see here is, again, we have forts interspersed with fortlets, exactly that configuration we first see in Wales and then turns up again in Scotland. And there is an awful lot of discussion about whether or not what we're seeing here is a defended highway or a frontier system in its own right. Happily, we don't have to worry about that today, but this does give us a great opportunity to look at the nature of the landscape in the area where Hadrian's Wall would soon be built. So we see this is one of 2 points where Britain narrows abruptly, and it creates a fantastic natural east-west corridor based around this river system here and this river system here. You have to move about 60 kilometres north or south to find another east-west natural corridor even remotely comparable to the quality of this one. The crucial point is this little area just here, known as the Tippold-Irving Gap, a 2.55 kilometre wide bottleneck of ground which connects the east and west valley systems and creates a natural junction in the landscape, allowing not just east-west movement, but also the only place where north-south movement is possible without having to make a river crossing. So a critical area of the landscape. Now, when we look at plans like this, it is easy to imagine that the Romans were free to indulge their frontier fantasies in an empty wilderness. But that is because we are only looking at what we would consider to be the Roman sites. So I will just direct your attention to this seemingly empty area just here, and press this button. This is what that starts to look like if you factor in the evidence for enclosed late Iron Age style settlements in the area. So what we see is not an empty space at all, but an area which was almost certainly densely occupied and farmed at around the time that work on Hadrian's Wall started. This is one of the huge stories that's come out of Hadrian's Wall studies over the last 20 years or so. Previously, it had been thought that late Iron Age settlement in the area was relatively small and sparse. But developer-funded archaeology has revealed a series of really very impressive Iron Age farmsteads, which surprised by virtue of their size, their sophistication, and their longevity. Some of these sites developed over periods of hundreds of years, so we are looking at a stable, sophisticated, settled farming community living in this area. Estimated population, perhaps 10 to 15,000 people just on the Northumberland coastal plain. You see here the Roman fort at Wall's End. That's a base intended for just over 500, well, a little over 500 soldiers. Comparable in size to some of these gigantic enclosed Iron Age settlements. So they weren't just farmers. We have the famous report from Vindelander Fort, which seems to be an account of enemy activity or the tactics that the Roman army was encountering on the Tyne-Solway Isthmus. This tells us that the Britons are unprotected by armour. There are very many cavalry. The cavalry do not use swords, nor do the wretched Britons mount in order to throw javelins. This seems to be a very nice companion piece to the kind of accounts of hit-and-run, mobile, unarmoured, spear-throwing attackers that we find in the ancient sources, and which is implied by the archaeology as well. So, violence was certainly an issue. We know that there was significant fighting in Britain at the beginning of Hadrian's reign. Exactly what form it took, where it was, we don't know, but there is absolutely no question that there was a significant number of Roman casualties. Here we see what appears to be a fragment of a Roman inscription which gives an account of where Hadrian fell, Hadrian's Wall falls in terms of the local context. The reconstructed text tells us that after the barbarians had been dispersed and the province of Britain had been recovered, he, presumably Hadrian, added a frontier line between either shore of the ocean for 80 miles. I've highlighted the word dispersed there, because this is supposed to be the text of some form of victory monument, possibly standing near Wall's End Fort. Dispersed is not really the sort of language you tend to expect from a Roman victory monument. Surrendered, destroyed, that sort of thing might seem more fitting. So here again, if dispersed is the best that they can credibly claim, what has happened? It suggests people who don't want to stick around and fight the Roman army, people who want to strike and escape and frustrate in that way. And on to Hadrian's Wall itself. I absolutely love this. I have shamelessly redrawn it from the original in Greaves and Dobson's Hadrian's Wall. And the reason that I like it is because this is the only place that Hadrian's Wall makes sense to me. As a straight line on a flat piece of paper, it would be genuinely hard to beat. So what do we see here? It's a comparatively lightly manned line. We have here the Stanegate Road to the south, with the forts along it providing the nearest sizable reinforcements. And on Hadrian's Wall itself, ditch to the north, the wall curtain, and then a group of smaller installations known as mile castles, and then turrets in between them. As this schematic suggests, the plan was incredibly uniform. Mile castles really were built at approximately, but not exactly, mile intervals, and you would have 2 turrets between them. That would create a surveillance point, a manned post, approximately every 495 metres along the Hadrian's Wall. It is a surveillance system on a scale that is utterly unprecedented in Britain, and I'm sure would have sent a shiver down the spine of any Iron Age Orwell. But what was it doing? You see the mile castles have the gateways in them as well. These were points where you could move through the wall. So if these were places where civilians, where traders could pass through the wall, it may not have been that great an obstacle. On the other hand, if they were intended as a military convenience, to minimise the inconvenience that the wall would have posed to Roman army manoeuvring, then the frontier would have been heavily restricted in terms of access. We would only know really of the 2 major highway crossings where perhaps civilians could have crossed. So let's take a look at what we have. The curtain itself, probably how most people imagine it, a huge stone edifice over there, but 1/3 of it was originally initially constructed of turf. We don't know why. Possibly it was hard to get stone in that area. Possibly it was because turf is much faster to build. Now, interestingly, this turf section is in the western portion of the wall. That's exactly that area where there was the larger number of forts, if you think back to the network of sites through northern England. And we will see throughout this talk that there are a number of things in the west that are a little bit different. The wall ditch at the misleadingly named Limestone Corner, misleading because it's not limestone, it's dolerite. And I particularly like this because it shows what could happen when reality got in the way. Dolerite, very difficult to dig through. See here, lovely bit of Roman ditch, and then what's happening over here, it's getting less and less deep until it more or less peters out there. They just gave up on it. They decided that it wasn't necessary for them to complete the wall ditch to the north of the wall curtain at this point. The wall itself, the ditch itself is also interesting because it stops when you get to the crags. We've seen the curtain continuing over the top of the crags, but they didn't continue the ditch at the bottom of them. The ditch could stop once you got into these areas where the terrain was doing much of the work. Mile Castle 42, the number 42 just telling you that it is approximately, but not exactly, 42 Roman miles from the wall's terminus at Wall's End. Now, one of my absolutely favourite things about Hadrian's Wall is when you take that regular spacing system that we've seen and impose it on irregular terrain. And of course, there are absurdities. This is many people's favourite, as I say, Mile Castle 42, where you have the Mile Castle built on sloping ground, facing even more sloping ground next to a pass on level ground just over here. And it raises that question of what were they doing? Why could they not just move it? Is this all an example of that old military adage that you are not paid to think? Now, in terms of who could pass through the Mile Castles, here we see a series of early Mile Castle internal layouts. I won't take you through these blow by blow, but the interesting thing is to look at A and F initially. You see small little barrack blocks tucked into the corner, but also gateways permitting passage through Hadrian's Wall. The garrison blocks probably suitable for about 8 people, something like that. And then B and C, 2 Mile Castles where, for whatever reason, north-south passage was not possible. The north gateways were either blocked up or did not exist at all. And they have comparably sized barrack blocks. The extraordinary implication is that the presence or absence of a gateway through Hadrian's Wall had no impact on the garrisoning requirements whatsoever, which must surely point towards whoever was using them needing minimum supervision. Therefore, perhaps better fit with them being for military rather than civilian use. And the turrets, A reminder here that the further we get from ground level, the less we know for certain. We don't know what the upper elements of the turrets look like, and here are 3 possibilities for you to enjoy. We also cannot say exactly what they were doing, but the most popular options are being used for shooting, surveillance, or signalling. And this just gives you a sense of how it all might have looked. So the mile castle down there, and then the regularly spaced turrets between them. But it did not come to pass. The plan changed significantly while work was underway, with the addition of a series of forts, as you see here, some of them positioned astride the curtain, and an enigmatic, a truly extraordinary earthwork known as the Vallum, running to the south of the wall. That is what you might think of simply as friendly territory, the Roman province itself. The forts adding approximately 9,000 soldiers to the immediate vicinity of the wall line. This is a radical change. And here we see those auxiliary forts positioned on or close to Hadrian's wall. And here the Vallum at Limestone Corner again. And the fascinating thing about this is that even though it is a bigger and far more substantial ditch than the wall ditch to the north, here it ploughs straight through that difficult rock at Limestone Corner. They absolutely complete the course of the Vallum ditch in this area. Why? So here we see the wall at the end of Hadrian's reign in 138. We've seen how it seems to have this, well, it does have this very ordered, regular spacing system on it. And it is calculated in such a way that it cannot take maximum advantage of the terrain. So you might reasonably conclude from that that the terrain itself is a secondary consideration. But look at the actual course of the wall here. See how it runs just to the north of that east-west valley corridor. It serves to cut it off from anyone who was approaching it from the north. So by coincidence or otherwise, its actual line through the landscape was of very great significance for who could move east and west in the area. So that suggestion that the terrain is of significance might encourage us to look further at exactly where some of the posts are. Now the forts which were built along the line of Hadrian's wall, generally speaking, we're told that they continue this regular arrangement. They had them built at intervals of maybe 7 1/3 miles, 7 2/3 Roman miles. But it was much more flexible. This is a beautiful example, Chester's Fort in the North Tyne Valley, and it was shifted out of what could be considered its measured location to put it right into the valley itself. We think that there's a cavalry unit based here, and it would have been absolutely perfectly positioned to move north into the uplands beyond, or south, and then into that east-west valley corridor. Excellent location to have your troops. And we also see an altar, which may well have been originally erected at this fort, which tells us of a prefect of cavalry who slaughtered a band of Coriolanitotai, fulfilled his vow to the god. Now this probably dates to later in the 2nd century, but it shows us that cavalry in the area were hunting down and engaging mobile groups, without a shadow of a doubt. So here, the landscape is of significance. And one of the wonderful things about Hadrian's Wall, because we have this regular system, because it is so incredibly predictable, we can see where the Roman army broke their own rules or chose to do something a little bit different. So here are just 3 of those. I have a whole series of plans like this, which I won't trouble you with. At the very top, mile castles that seem to be built earlier than the other mile castles. So they're not all in one place, they're not being built just from east to west or something like that. You have them scattered along the line of the wall. Down here, forts that were built particularly closely together. And down here, areas where it remained easier to cross the wall ditch. Now, in and of themselves, you might think, well, it's interesting that these anomalies exist, but they don't seem to tell us a huge amount. But if you take a whole series of them and superimpose them onto a single map, something quite interesting jumps out. You get this. And as I hope you can see, there is a significant concentration of anomalies, of unusual things, immediately in and around the Tybalt earthen gap. that critical natural junction which anchors the region together and which is crucial for controlling movement through the area. So the decision to break with the overall concept, to do things a little bit differently, particularly in this area, suggests that there was a very real interest in being able to control north-south movement through this region. And as construction goes on, we seem to see a greater interest in positioning the sites at critical points within the landscape. Here, alas, the best photo we can get, as this tower was discovered and then destroyed shortly afterwards in 1880. The then historian of war studies, Collingwood Bruce, observed that as far as any other turrets were concerned, it would be better if they continued to enjoy the protection of the earth that now covers them until such time as England becomes an educated nation. But as you can see, I hope, it is perched right on the edge of the crag, a really beautiful location in the landscape. And here again, another turret positioned at a right angle next to a defile crossing the line of the wall. It would be extraordinary if this had been thrown up by chance by the spacing system, and indeed it was not. This is one of the biggest deviations between the actual and measured location of a site known on the wall, surely so that it could control passage across this defile later. Later on, we see an additional tower built here in a blind spot on the curtain at a point where people might try and cross the curtain unobserved. And the size of the installation is interesting. They've gone for the smallest option available to them, just a tower. They could have put a fortlet in there, a fort, if they'd really wanted to. But that suggests that they're interested in trying to stop movement by relatively small groups across the line of the wall. And here, the gateway later punched through the wall at a slightly more sensible point in the location, in the landscape. So we see an interest in the landscape seeming to reassert itself. So what does all of this tell us about what it was that Hadrian's Wall did? Well, one thing that it certainly did was that it posed a problem for that group living to the north of the wall on the Northumberland coastal plain. Our evidence from finds and radiocarbon dates suggests that this long-lived community petered out in around AD 120 to 140, exactly the time that the wall was becoming operational. Exactly what happened to them is a matter of much discussion, but this seems to strongly suggest that the wall was doing something and it had an impact. In fact, I think from what we've just seen, these continued, sustained revisions and refinements to the wall system over time strongly suggest that this is not a piece of imperial rhetoric, that it had a practical purpose, and as it was being built, the army was finding ways to make it more efficient and more effective. So, what about the other possibilities? Trade across the line of the wall, the peaceful movement of people. It's certainly possible, but there's very little in the way of actual material that we can say came from the north and ended up in the south. Equally, did they really need such a monumental structure to just regulate the movement of people? Did any Roman frontier which was less massively built mean it was unable to regulate the movement of people? But then conversely, cast your minds back to the original plan for Hadrian's Wall, this relatively lightly manned line with the mile castles and the turrets. Could that have repelled a barbarian army? Perhaps then, we should be thinking a little bit more in terms of these mobile, elusive Britons that we hear about in the ancient sources and that the archaeology suggests exists. A real problem for a regular army trying to combat such groups is when they can move in and out of the combat area at ease. If they have access to safe havens and support beyond the area of Roman control, it would make them much, much harder to defeat. Hadrian's Wall would put a stop to that. It would be very, very much harder for such groups to be able to move in and out of the Roman area of control once the wall was in place. So just possibly, the Britons' ability to wage effective guerrilla warfare is one of the elements that helps us to understand what it was that Hadrian's Wall was doing. Also, there's a book.